Hey friends and family, I just wanted to get on real quick to let you know that this episode does contain content that could be triggering for some. We discuss mental illness, therapy, suicidal ideation, as well as a quote from John MacArthur about mental illness that could be discouraging. So if any of those things are triggering for you, this may not be the best episode to listen to. Also, quick announcement that we will be postponing all future episodes indefinitely. Life has been a roller coaster for both Piper and I. She's been working full-time, taking care of her baby, as well as balancing out friendships and time for her husband. And I've been going through some stuff with my family. Every week seems to have a new and crazy thing come up. And we are also gone most of the summer. So handling editing and social media has become difficult for me. And Piper does also not have time to help out with the podcast. So we love this podcast and we love you guys, but we just decided family is more important right now, as well as the other things that we have going on, and that it would just be wise to take a breather. We don't know what it will look like in the future, whether we'll just take a break for the summer or all together, but we want to thank you for joining us on this adventure and supporting us as we've been figuring all of that out. We really appreciate it. We appreciate all the supports and love that we've been given, so thank you for that. And with that, let's dive into the episode.
We are live.
Well,
Hello.
hello, everybody, to the Unveiling Podcast. I'm Piper,
And I'm Grace.
and today we actually have on a guest. We have on a guest, Miss Stephanie. Introduce yourself. Tell us about why you're here, what you do, and who you are.
Well, first and foremost, I'm Grace's sister.
Yes.
Best title of my life.
Oh. No.
So I am here. I am a mental health therapist of 6 years. I've been working in the mental health field for 7, but have been practicing as a therapist since 2018. I am in the process of transitioning into the role of life coach, which is very exciting.
I'm excited to talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. We'll dive in a little bit later. So just here to talk about some of the controversy in the mental health field that we've been seeing in recent years. I'm really excited for this conversation.
I was gonna say, I'm so ready. There's so much information out there right now about therapy and over therapization, or like shoving your feelings to the side. You know, it's like it's like black and white one way or the other. I'm just very interested to have a conversation.
Yeah, it feels like it's with Instagram and TikTok. It's just everywhere. Like therapy videos everywhere. And I've talked with Stephanie about how I literally swore I was autistic for years because of Instagram posts.
Okay, I'm very excited to talk about that.
Yeah.
About how social media has influenced all of
Yes,
us.
it's
Yeah,
insane.
I have a lot of thoughts on that. There's an oversaturation, I think, right now, and I think it's very well intentioned, but creating a lot of confusion for people as well.
Confusion's a good word.
Yeah. Well, do you want to explain real quick just therapy culture and DSM?
Yes. Yeah, so I
don't
think...
know what DSM is. I don't know what that is.
Yeah,
I was gonna say,
DSM is the diagnostic manual that therapists use. So it is a very thick book with over 300 diagnoses in it.
Wow.
So initially, I think it was in the 1840s that people started to really put together like criteria for diagnoses. And I think understanding this history is really important. Not a lot of people know the history of racism, that is the DSM. So one of the first diagnoses placed in the DSM was what is called drapetomania. And so this was a diagnosis that was used to describe enslaved individuals who were trying to flee captivity.
Whoa.
Wow.
Yes.
And it was, so
That was considered...
enslaved individuals that were trying to escape, that was considered
A mental
health.
Wow.
Yes.
I didn't know that.
Yes.
Whoa. Okay.
Yeah. So I think that understanding
Not
that
a
is...
great start.
Yeah. No, not a great start.
jumping off point for DSM.
Yeah, a lot has, I mean, we also know that there's been a lot of discrimination against women. So women were more likely to be deemed as hysterical,
Yes.
Or were described as insane for having very natural,
or even just having our own
emotions.
mind. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think understanding that history is really important because there is a subjectivity with the DSM. There's not a lot of science to support it. Basically, what it is psychiatrists from all different parts coming together and saying these are our observations about people's symptomology. But the DSM is forever changing. And as it should, we're learning more and more about how emotions work, what symptoms people are presenting with. But at the same time, I think it's important to understand that not all of it is rooted in hard science. A lot of it is observation, which I think can be very powerful. But I also believe that there's a lot of emphasis placed on diagnostics where there doesn't always need to be emphasis.
Yeah. Just kind of like everything's a diagnosis.
Yes. Yeah. So
what kind of issues would that create? Like an overemphasis on diagnosis?
So probably the biggest concern that I've seen with it is people just over-identifying with their diagnosis, where it almost becomes like an integral part of who they are. And I think historically the mental health field has not done a great job talking about how diagnoses can also ebb and flow. That just because you've been diagnosed with something doesn't mean that you're stuck with it forever.
Yeah.
So as an example, I have been diagnosed historically with generalized anxiety disorder and major depressive disorder. So I do have a history of both of those. Technically, I think if I were to go to a therapist today, they could probably say that I meet criteria for generalized anxiety disorder. I personally don't identify with it anymore, but the problem with the mental health field right now is that when insurance is involved, we have to have a diagnosis.
For therapy to be covered.
Yes.
Oh my gosh.
Yes. So some
Insurance.
therapists...
Oh, we love them.
Yes.
We love insurance.
So there is what we call an adjustment disorder. And there are different types of adjustment disorders, some that have anxious mood, some that have depressed mood. And that's basically a placeholder in our way of saying this person has gone through an adjustment in their life and they're having a very natural reaction to this. But unfortunately, insurance companies will not pay for that on a long-term basis. So like at the very most, you can have that diagnosis for 6 months. And if something more concrete is not established, insurance potentially will stop paying for services. So this is part of why we're seeing a lot of therapists move into self-pay only. But then those therapists are receiving a lot of criticism for not making their services more accessible. So therapists are in a really unique position right now of
That's good context to have.
not wanting to make our services inaccessible, but at the same time knowing that there are limitations because insurance also... Basically, you have to justify everything you do. And for some therapists, especially those who take a more holistic approach, there's a lot of concern about insurance companies not paying for those approaches. Which is, I have a lot of thoughts on that as well. So, yeah, therapists' hands, I feel like a lot of therapists feel like their hands are tied right now of feeling the pressure to diagnose. But also we have a burden because there are some diagnoses that once on your medical record can prevent you from getting things like life insurance. So, for example, I've had clients who have been diagnosed with bipolar and now cannot get life insurance because statistically they are considered to be more likely to end their life by suicide. So it can affect a lot.
Yeah. Dang, that's crazy. So where, I guess, going back to like DSM and that sort of thing, how do you, I guess, where would be the balance of understanding that like observation is like great and can be very valuable in diagnosing things, and then where it can, I don't know, do you understand what I'm trying to say? Like, how do you balance like this is like a valuable thing, but at the same time, like, how do you as a therapist who kind of is walking this line, how do you continue to therapize people? And well, you're obviously shifting, but how have you been able to kind of walk that line of therapizing people and trying to be there for them and help them and give them answers while also understanding that this is not actually all the answers, you know?
Yeah. I think a lot of it is, so I do a lot of identity work with my clients. And I think that's been really an important shift in my work, because the symptoms are important. If I have a client who is chronically experiencing depression, I'm going to encourage you, if you feel comfortable with it, to seek out medication with a psychiatrist or with your primary care doctor. You know, if there's a diagnosis of bipolar, absolutely, let's seek out some medication to help get you stabilized, right? So I think it's definitely that balance of like, we still need modern approaches. Yeah. But then once we are able to help clients get to a more steady and stable place, I do a lot of identity work. So essentially the way I do it, I review diagnoses with my clients in our first session, or if I ever make changes throughout the course of their treatment. And after that, diagnosis is not typically mentioned in my office. I do it because I believe clients deserve to know what's going on in their official medical record. Yeah. And it's amazed me how many clients have never been told their diagnoses from previous providers. Yeah. And I have not. I've seen 5 therapists throughout my adult life, and only one of them ever informed me of diagnosis.
Yeah. So when I was a kid, I was told I wasn't allowed to be told what my diagnosis was.
Why? Why is that a thing? Why would they not share?
I'll be honest, I don't know.
That is so intriguing to me.
If you are seeking therapy, you have every right to know your diagnosis. You also have every right to access your records.
Do you think sometimes therapists do it to kind of save themselves because you don't know how a patient's going to respond to their diagnosis?
Potentially.
I keep them coming back to therapy.
It's hard for me to say because I've just never taken that approach. But yeah, I think that sometimes it can be a difficult conversation to have, especially depending on the diagnosis. Granted, I usually, I only diagnose like the least invasive. So typically I'm diagnosing my clients with generalized anxiety disorder, major depressive disorder. Like those are my 2 most common diagnoses. If I had to put a percentage on my caseload right now, I would say probably like 85 to 90% of my clients have one or both of those diagnoses. Anything more than that, I usually prefer to have psychological testing. Because there's also, I think it's really important to understand how much overlap there is in symptomology. And I think this is kind of a segue into some of the problems that we're seeing with TikTok and Instagram therapies. So there is so much overlap in symptoms. Yeah. It's wild to me.
What does that mean, like overlap in symptoms?
So, for example, sleep concerns, difficulty falling or staying asleep can be both a sign of depression and anxiety. Yeah. There are ADHD and bipolar have some overlap with impulsivity. So when somebody's in a manic episode, somebody who does not have well-managed ADHD can also exhibit really impulsive behaviors that are more consistent with that.
Interesting.
And so I think understanding that is so important because, and this goes back to your point where you thought for years that you had a diagnosis, and you recently sent me a video, Grace, where you were like, oh, according to this, like I have this diagnosis. And it was a video of a person who was diagnosed being on the autism spectrum. And they were sharing some of their symptoms. And I'm all for relatability and sharing your experience. But the way that the video was presented was, oh, because I'm autistic, that's what the person was saying, because I'm autistic, like these are things I do.
I do X, Y, and Z.
And I watched the video, and like they're very basic human behaviors that can be exhibited by anybody.
Well, what's frustrating too is like ADHD and autism. I've seen multiple videos, and I'm like, I do all of that. And then my therapist had to tell me, he was like, just so you know, you've gone through trauma in your life, and that can present as ADHD.
Correct.
Like my diagnosis is PTSD, like severe. And he was like, yeah, I don't. He was like, you've been tested as a kid and told you don't have ADHD. I was tested once or twice. And then he was like, I don't think you present that now. When you explain to me your ADHD symptoms, quote unquote, he was like, it seems like a response to something that someone did that triggered you, from like something that's happened in your past. And then autism, I don't even know, like I think we forget that, like, those videos are made for people who know they are autistic to be relatable, and then a random person who's not just sees that and it's like, oh, I do that. And then they're like, am I autistic? Like, and then it's a fear.
Do you think it comes from, like, a desire maybe to belong, to be a part of something?
Oh, yeah.
To explain, like, things that are so normal that we do as humans. Like, we're all, you know, God's creation, we all do wacky things, and we want to put labels on something, I feel like, because it makes it so much easier when you have a label to put on it. And it's like, oh, I'm in that group. This is I'm fixed now. Like, I know what's going on, so now I have this label. And then I've noticed that people get tired of the label. So it's like, oh, I'm autistic. And then they wear that for a while, but then it's not enough. And then, well, I think I have something else. Oh, I'm also bipolar. Oh, I also have ADHD. Well, I'm also depressed. I also have anxiety. I feel like we're trying to collect titles. We're trying to collect diagnoses so that we feel complete. Where, like, and not to, like, over spiritualize. Everything needs to be over spiritualized, but not to over spiritualize it. But I feel like I don't know. I feel like a lot of issues could be solved if we realize that we're never actually going to be complete and find the golden nugget, the golden ticket, as you call it, you know?
Our diagnosis isn't going to fix us.
And not to say that you shouldn't do work and be aware, you know what I mean? But, like, whatever diagnosis, it's not going to fix it. Whatever you find, it's not going to be the answer so you feel completely yourself.
I think we forget it's a diagnosis so that we can get help, and then people are like, oh, well, I have this diagnosis, so this is just who I am, and you have to accept it. It's an excuse sometimes, not everyone, but I've seen that with a lot of people who have ADHD. Like, they just use it as an excuse, and it's like, you know who I'm talking about.
Yes.
But it's like, no, you were given that diagnosis so you can figure out how to manage yourself properly, not just to sit with that and be like, oh, well, this is why I'm this way, you know?
Right. Yeah, I think there's a lot of nuance with this part of the conversation because on the one hand, I also know for so many individuals how similarly to our physical health, right? We know this is really common with women. You have all these physical symptoms and your doctor, like, gets the labs back and is like, everything's normal. And I think we've seen the same with mental health. And so on the one hand, I also think that there are a lot of people who have been suffering for years because they were diagnosed incorrectly with their mental health. And therefore, so for example, anxiety and ADHD can have a lot of overlap of symptoms, as well as complex PTSD and ADHD. And complex PTSD is not actually a diagnosis in the United States yet, and I'm not happy about it because I think that it would explain a lot for a lot of people. But you can present as a very anxious individual, and actually the concern is ADHD. And so what's happening is people are getting treated for anxiety, but really the root cause is inattention, hyperactivity. And so on the one hand, I do think that for some people, it's after years of trying methods that have been designed to treat anxiety. The treatment for anxiety is not the same as it is for ADHD. And so on the one hand, I do think accurate diagnosing can be really helpful and really freeing for a lot of people of like, oh my gosh, this is why I am the way that I am. And an example that we've been seeing a lot on Instagram and TikTok is women in my age group, so millennials who are in their 30s and are just now getting diagnosed as ADHD because women actually present more high functioning with ADHD. So they're more likely to be an inattentive type of ADHD. So they exhibit perfectionistic, people-pleasing performance tendencies, and which are very much so praised by society. And then these women are getting burnt out, and come to find out they've had symptoms since childhood, which by the way is part of the criteria for ADHD. They have exhibited these symptoms since childhood, and now it's like, oh my gosh, I can get the medication, I can get the type of therapy that I need. So I think in that sense, diagnosing can be really helpful. And on the other hand, you're right, we do have a lot of people over-identifying with their diagnoses. And I've been saying for years, I think a lot of the reason that we're seeing that is the lack of community that we have. I think people are seeking validation through diagnoses when in reality what they need is community. And needing community.
Put that on a pillow.
And here's the thing, we can have both. We can have therapy and we can have community.
Yeah.
But I think there's a lot of confusion right now of what it looks like to actually engage in community. And Grace and I were kind of talking about this a little bit earlier. I think that we have a couple generations right now that are really struggling with how to have friendship. And, you know, we see this a lot on Instagram where people talk about, like, don't trauma dump on your friends. And I agree wholeheartedly. Like, I should not be walking up to one of my friends and be like, hey, let me tell you this super traumatic incident from my childhood. Like, you just take it. No, absolutely not. At the same time, though, I think what we're seeing is people who are not well equipped to help their friends navigate hard times. So, an example, a really good friend of mine, very well-meaning, one time had just asked how I was doing. I was going through it. I had just gone through a breakup. And so they asked how I was doing, and I just said, yeah, you know, really going through it. And kind of the first response was, like, have you considered going back to therapy? And again, a very well-intentioned comment, right?
Right.
But I was like, no, therapy's not on my radar right now. Like, I think I just need support from people in my life. And it's interesting because I was talking about that with just several people, and kind of the consensus was like, yeah, I don't think we're well equipped to help people through that stuff.
Well, yeah, because it's like breakup is, everyone goes through a breakup, and that's a normal emotion to deal with that. And it's like, if you don't have friends who support you in that way to the point where you need a therapist to support you in that way, it's like, sorry, I heard Desi in that voice.
My baby's crying. He's in a fussy face.
It's like, well, what's wrong in our community now to where we can't support each other for, it's not a small thing because breakups suck, but like for something as normal as a breakup to where you look at your friend, it's like, you thought of therapy? It's like, you don't need therapy for a breakup unless it was, you know, maybe abusive or...
Absolutely.
But it was like a very typical breakup. And so, Yeah, but I think a lot of that is the Instagram and TikTok culture, right? Of everything you're supposed to go to a therapist for. And absolutely, if you are struggling with your mental health, please seek out treatment. There is no shame in that. Look, I've seen, like I said earlier, 5 therapists since I was 21 years old. So over the course of a decade, and I've gone to therapy for many different reasons. So the therapy is beneficial. It is necessary at times, right? But I think for some people, there's a frustration right now of like, do I actually need to go pay somebody to listen to me? Like, why do I think people are, and I'm just going to speak for myself, I've been struggling with, I don't know that these are things that need to be presented to a therapist. I think these are things that I need people to listen and to just validate, to be there for me, to see me, right? And I think a lot, I can really only speak for millennials because that's my friend group, but millennials really struggle with this. Big time. Big time. And I've even noticed with some of my friendships that there's also some people who really struggle to receive that support. And I think that's something that has been really interesting to observe. Is like, oh, well, I don't want to burden you. And I'm like, look, I'm showing up for you because I'm well aware that one day you're going to have to show up for me. Like, there's reciprocity here. And it's almost like people have gotten into this mindset of like, oh no, I'm just being a burden. And I'm like, no, you're going through it. Life is hard. This life can be absolutely brutal at different points. And I would hate if somebody were to not offer me that support, so I want to be that for other people. And people just are really having a hard time receiving that care and that love. What do you think that is? Like, do you have an idea of like why your generation, honestly, I think Gen Z struggles with that too. I think Gen Z is more just a little bit more self-focused, and so we don't think of like, what can I do for my friend?
Whatever, I mean, our generation, like, I think we're consistently becoming more and more narcissistic. Like, not diagnosed narcissistic, but more narcissistic tendency.
Yeah, we've been given everything we want. Which I understand, because our generation of parents wasn't given a lot, so they want to, but it has kind of raised up a bratty generation of like, we get what we want, and like, you need to give me what I want as a friend, but then never thinking of like giving that back. But like, from millennials, what do you think issue. Shame?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I see a lot of shame driving millennials, and as somebody who also greatly struggles with shame, I think a lot of it keeps us from community. And shame is really interesting because I think it's also very self-focused.
Say it again.
Shame is so self-focused. And I still wrestle with this on a regular basis. So there is no judgment if you are the person that deeply struggles with shame. I was struggling with it this past week. I don't remember what happened, but there was some instance where I was like, oh my gosh, I said this stupid thing. And I was like spending like a good hour thinking about how this friend must hate me. And then I was like, that's really bold of me to assume that my friends just sit around thinking about me all the time. And, you know, shame is hard
I
because...
didn't appreciate that call out.
You know, shame is so difficult. I think for a lot of us, a lot of the women that I work with, myself included, shame is really rooted in a lot of childhood stuff. So for me, I think a lot of my shame developed as a result of my biological father leaving when I was 4.5 years old. Because children are what we call egocentric, meaning that they believe that the world revolves around them, right? So when something bad happens in a child's life, they don't have reasoning abilities the way that we do as adults. So children internalize everything. So when something bad happens to them, the only way children know how to think is, oh, something bad happened because of me. So I think it's really important to acknowledge that for a lot of people, their shame is rooted in childhood dynamics that they experience with their families, childhood trauma. The reasons could be endless. So I think it's really important to acknowledge that. But I think that's why identity work is so important. Because I think shame is just keeping us all trapped. Like it's paralyzing at times. And I think what happens is people are just so shame-based that community just feels terrifying. Because
it points out the stuff that we're shameful of. Like if you're in a community and eventually like they're going to see who you are and either lovingly or sometimes not, they're going to point out those things and be like, hey, I've noticed this in you. And that's really hard to take, even like in a healthy way. Like, and we talked about that in our friendship episode of just like
we
how
got a lot of good feedback on that episode.
Yeah, we did. But just like talking about how we've lovingly pointed stuff out with each other, and that's really hard, but like you need that for growth and to do better. And
it should be hard. I mean, if someone is calling out something that's not Christ-like in you or something that's not a healthy tendency, we're not going to respond, oh, you dear precious one, thank you for alerting me to this way in which I've been living.
I love that you finally noticed that about me. Thank you.
I'm so happy to know that about myself. We're probably going to respond poorly, which is why there needs to be, I feel like, community, like you're saying, is so key on both sides, and like patience on both sides, because like Grace may be like, hey, I'm noticing this, and I might not respond well. And so I feel like that's where sometimes like that narcissistic, like egocentric sometimes tendency can carry over, and like, you didn't respond well, now I'm gonna like shut you down or whatever, or walk away. And that's like you said, there's like important.
Well, I think what's so interesting about shame is it tends to keep us in cycles of self-sabotage, particularly with relationships. So I find that a lot of people that struggle with shame deeply desire community, but then their behaviors sabotage that community.
Why does that happen? Like this, can you, like, we don't have time to go way into the deep dive, but I'm interested a little bit if you can briefly explain like self-sabotage, like how that works.
Yeah, so self-sabotage, I think it's really important to understand that above all else, our brain is wired for familiarity. Familiarity to our brains is equivalent to survival. So if your shame is rooted in relationship wounds, as wild as this sounds, your brain is going to really struggle to have healthy relationships because it's not familiar to you. So that's usually where self-sabotage is coming from, is a desire for what's familiar. So this is part of why we see people in cycles. You know, a great example is dating relationships. I work with so many women and have struggled with this myself, of just choosing really unhealthy partners, even though that's not what you actually want. But then you end up in one and you're like, oh my gosh, this is awful. Like, why am I subjecting myself to it? And almost every time it can be taken back to some type of wounding that happened in relationship. And
so it's not like that this is bad, but you're choosing it anyway. It's more of like you may not be aware, but subconsciously, like, is your self-worth tied to like that, like self-sabotage, that sort of thing?
I think in some cases, yeah. I think there's so many factors that can go into it, so it's hard to put like a one-size-fits-all. But I do see where a lot of time self-sabotage is related to low self-worth. I think sometimes for people there's an awareness, but I think when shame is running the show, there's not a lot of trust in oneself to make healthy decisions. And so it's like, well, yeah, that might be a red flag, but like maybe it's me. Yeah. I see that a lot. Maybe it's me. Maybe there's something wrong with my perception. Maybe, and I'm just speaking from my own experience, like some of the narratives have been, oh, well, it's not as bad as the last person.
Comparing.
Or, oh, you do have really high standards, and maybe you're just being really unrealistic about what you want for your life. So I think there's so many different narratives that can play a role in self-sabotaging behaviors. But typically what I see is an extensive history of shame, which equates to low self-worth. And in women, I see a lot of people-pleasing, perfectionism, and performance. And so that kind of speaks to your point a few moments ago about, what if people see me? Like, that is so scary when you struggle with shame.
It's so wild how people want to be seen so desperately and not at the same time. It's like, I want to be seen a certain way.
Exactly. I literally was about to say that. Yeah.
But not fully seen for like who I am.
Yeah.
How do you think that relates to social media, kind of in moving into that conversation? Like you said, wanting to be seen versus not wanting to be seen, and all of that tying into our mental health and therapy. How do you think social media has influenced all of these tendencies, all of these things?
Oh gosh, I think it's it's interesting. I have struggled with, I'm 31, and I have struggled with deep loneliness in my life since I was 14 years old. And age 14 is also when social media was introduced into my life. And I really do, I'm not going to say that it's causation, but I do think there's a very strong correlation. Because let's be honest, the majority are putting their best foot forward, right? Yeah. And so I think with social media, one of the biggest dangers I see of it is that people watch a 30, 60-second reel and think they have the whole story. And this is why we see people getting like up in arms in the comment section, because people are like, I know all about your life because I watched 3 or 4 reels of yours every single week. And so what's happening is, like, this is kind of like a cheesy phrase, but like I've heard it said, like, oh, well, you're comparing your behind the scenes to everybody's highlight reel. Now, granted, I think there are some people who have shared more vulnerably on social media.
But even that, it's glamorized. It's not, like, I could share about something hard in my life on Instagram, which I've done many times before, but all people do is praise you for it, because it's like, oh, you're being so vulnerable, like, good job for opening up. And it's like you take your broken pieces, but then you almost get addicted to the dopamine hit from like your broken pieces. It's like, it's hard.
Yeah. Well, and I think, at least for me, I also have a history of like posting very vulnerable information, and here's the thing, though. I don't have to deal with people's actual reactions.
Yeah. It's safe.
It is safe. If somebody doesn't like what I wrote, I'm not going to know.
Yeah.
Well, at least on my private Instagram. Public Instagrams might be different. But like on my private one, if people like roll their eyes at it, I don't know. I just know the people that like it.
Even publicly,
you
can pick and choose who's allowed to comment and who's not.
Right.
And if you're going to read the comments, like, it's all very filtered.
Yes. And so I don't say that to take away from the people who have chosen to share very vulnerable information. That is not what I'm trying to do. And at the same time, I think that social media has given us the sense of community without the actual community. And I think that's what's so dangerous about it, is we feel, keyword feel, connected to others because we get glimpses of their lives throughout the week. But in reality, though that desire for connection is not actually being fulfilled through social media. And so I think for a lot of people there is shame of like, oh, my house isn't picture perfect, or you know, this person like is so successful now, and like it's like, yeah, maybe they are successful, but like how many hours of work went into that we didn't see? You know, there's so much there. And I think that social media has its place. I think that there are many benefits to it, but I also see a lot of harm that's come with it. And like I said, in my own life, my loneliness really began when Facebook was introduced into my life. And I would see when certain friends were hanging out without me.
Oh, man.
Oh, my
Those
gosh.
kicked me in the shins in high school. That was a rough time.
That was really rough for me. I struggled with my former best friend. She had a very active social life and was very popular, and I was not as popular. And so, like, everybody wanted to be friends with her, and she would post all the time, and I would just be stuck at home alone on the weekends. And, like, it just created so much insecurity for me. And you know, I think even now it's like, I was talking to Stephen about this actually one time. I was like, yeah, you know, I was worried about so-and-so finding out that we were hanging out without them. And then I was like, but I think I'm only worried about that because I assumed that pictures were going to be posted on Instagram. And he was like, yeah, you know, you don't have to do that. And I was like, thank you, Stephen. Yes, I do. But yeah, I think we're filtering things through a lens of social media. And
we're also not supposed to know everybody's lives. I think that's the thing too, is our life, there are areas that need to be private. We don't need to see a photo every time someone hangs out with someone, like, or see all the details into their lives. That is going to cause comparison. It has to. That's just how it is for us. Like, we compare ourselves to others, so when we're seeing too many details of people's lives, we're just going to take that and be like, oh my gosh, I need to do that, or why am I not out with these friends? And it's like, yeah, but you knew you just hung out with someone by yourself like a week ago, so why are you worrying about that? So yeah, I think the danger of social media is a balance of like, we don't see enough, but sometimes we also see too much.
Yes. No, absolutely. Well, and I think the information overload, especially as it relates to therapy, right? I mean, I'm not going to lie. I'm a therapist, and like probably 6 months to a year ago, I kept getting these reels of women in my age group who were getting diagnosed with ADHD, and I was like, oh my gosh, do I have ADHD? Like, and like, I diagnose people.
It's impossible. Yeah,
and like, even I fell into the trap of like, and my symptoms, I actually do present with symptoms that are ADHD-like, but these symptoms have not been present since before the age of 12, which again is part of the diagnostic criteria. And like, my ADHD-like symptoms have been influenced by social media because I'm constantly seeking out dopamine hits, and I struggle to focus.
Do you think
we're
sometimes
in such a fast-moving culture? Not to interrupt you, but like off of that, we live in such a like fast. I feel like people, like, I feel like factoring in the environment that you're living in is extremely key as well. Would you say, like, as a therapist, like, is that something that a factor that a lot of people leave out?
Oh yeah. I see this a lot, particularly with work environments. I cannot tell you how many of my clients right now, their anxiety has stemmed from work culture. Like, we're talking like these people are having to go to urgent care because their symptoms are so severe. And environment plays such a huge factor in our presentation of symptoms. I'm not saying that it's everything. There are genetic components to take into consideration. But I do see where for a lot of people, their anxiety in particular is being exacerbated by the environments that they're in. Surrounding themselves with unhealthy relationships, unhealthy dating relationships. And that's been something that's been really challenging to navigate as a therapist. because I do think part of therapy culture right now is that people, not all, but a lot of people are coming to the therapeutic process expecting things to be fixed. I feel like a lot of people are like, tell me what to do. And
quick answer so that we can continue
Yes.
with our lifestyle, when in fact the lifestyle might be
The issue.
The issue.
Yes. And you know, I recently had a client who just kind of called herself out. She was like, hey, I actually think I want to stop therapy because this is my source of stress and I'm not ready to change it.
Wow.
Y'all, I sat back and I was like, what is
Proud
happening?
therapist moment.
And, you know, I was really proud of that person because I think that we have to be ready for a change. We have to be willing to acknowledge that sometimes we're subjecting ourselves to a set of circumstances that are ultimately not healthy for us. Yes, sometimes there are mental health issues that are already at play. Like I said, genetic components. There's that family history, right? But for some people, what I'm seeing is people are really struggling to live lives that are in alignment. That's what I'm seeing a lot of, is clients don't know how to, a lot of my clients don't know how to move into alignment with their values. And I'll be honest, most people don't even know their values. And my life coach has been so helpful. Rocio, she's a gem. Pretty much anybody in my life knows her.
Talks about her like it's her best friend.
Yeah, Rocio has changed my life, and she's an identity coach. So she's really, we've been working together for almost 3 years now, and has really done some really deep identity work with me, and was the one who kind of brought my attention to, like, let's figure out your values, and that that was the best thing, and also like the worst, because then I had to acknowledge that I was saying I valued these things. I say that I value community. I say that I value authenticity. But facing those values, I also had to face the fact that I was not living in alignment with them.
Yeah.
And I'll be honest, you know, like, the last few years has been a struggle for me to live my life in alignment with values. And I can confidently say for myself that that's where a lot of my anxiety has come from. I'm not going to say all of it. We do have a family history of anxiety for the women in our family. But, a lot of it has been the choices. And I think that's a conversation that I've really struggled to have as a therapist, because, like I said earlier, there's so much nuance with all of this. So much.
There's no like actual like hardcore black.
You
and
can't
white,
put
right or
everything
wrong.
into a box.
Yes.
Yeah.
And when we were on break, I was telling Grace about this. Like, I was like, there's even a little bit of nervousness because I feel the burden of this conversation, right? Like, I feel it so heavily. Like, I was praying about it last night of like, God, like, give me the words, because I don't want somebody to walk away from this feeling like therapy is bad, or that life coaching is the only way, or that, if you just have the right community, your mental health problems will go away, because none of that is absolute.
Yeah.
I think that the three of us could all have very different solutions. And, you know, maybe for me, community would be the thing that really helps me with transformation the most in my life. And for you, it could be therapy. Like, I think there's so much here that is hard to fit into, like, however long our conversation is going to be. And, there's a weight to it, because when clients walk into my office, like, I am dealing with their hearts and their minds. And, that's not something that I take lightly. And I specialize in trauma, and so, like, there's a heaviness that comes with that.
Delicacy.
And I think for people that have endured trauma in particular, like, yes, therapy all the way. Let's help you work through that, because there's so much there. And I think that kind of segues into some of the biblical counseling.
Yeah.
We had wanted to touch today on some of John MacArthur's.
Yeah, I would love to balance it out with touching up on the risk of acknowledging the value of therapy and that it is a real thing that is needed. And we wanted to start off with MacArthur's recent quote on just the dangers of that. And if you don't know that quote, he basically, in short summary, if you want to read it, you have it?
I have it. There's no such thing as PTSD. There's no such thing as OCD. There's no such thing as ADHD. Those are noble lies to basically give the excuse to medicate people.
Do you think people do use those as an excuse or jump to medication too quickly for things sometimes?
I honestly don't see that as much with my clientele. I really don't. In fact, I have a lot of clients who are like, medication is my last resort. I do think it can be out there. I think doctors are very quick to prescribe.
Yes.
Okay.
I don't see clients seeking it out as much, though.
Yes.
I think that the issue is more doctors in particular are really ill-equipped.
So explain.
Yeah.
You read this quote and then...
Share your rage. Just rage.
You know, I think a lot of it for me, I don't want my clients to over-identify with their diagnoses. And at the same time, particularly with PTSD, because like I said, I do a lot of trauma work, but also with OCD, they are absolutely debilitating. And when I think of...
Sorry if you hear my daughter crying in the background. She's also angry.
You might hear me crying in a moment. When I tell you that I have heard absolute horror in my office, stories. I have heard stories that are not mine, but there are horrific things that happen to people in this world. There is so much evil that I have heard in my 7 years in this field. And to have somebody just so carelessly say these things don't exist, these are lies, just to get you medicated. I have never worked with anybody who has a diagnosis of PTSD or ADHD or OCD or bipolar who wants it, because it is hell. I don't know one of my clients with PTSD who wishes that the nightmares continue, who wishes to wake up every day wondering when somebody's going to attack them again. And so I think to hear that, the lack of consideration, it's so out of touch.
Yeah.
Like, first of all, the criteria for PTSD alone it's a lot.
Yeah.
You don't just flippantly diagnose somebody with PTSD.
It's not like, oh, you have PTSD. It's like, it's extensive.
Yeah. And so I think to hear something like that, for me, knowing the stories that I know, I can't wrap my head around it, to be honest with you. I'm a little at a loss for words still.
I think, like, my viewpoint on it isn't... I think it is inconsiderate. I don't think he fully thought it through. It also clearly comes from someone who probably has never struggled in their life in that way, and who is just ignorant to other people's issues, which is a huge concern for a pastor to have.
I feel like it does feel very flippant.
Yes.
Very.
But also, I think...
sorry.
Oh, you're fine. I also think maybe the way to look at it is, we do deal with mental health issues because of the sin in the world. Like, that started with Adam and Eve, and... we wouldn't struggle with OCD, PTSD, if we didn't have sinful people who hurt us, and if we just if we had healthy bodies like that, wasn't full of sin. But also, you got to remember, we do have a loving God who still wants to take care of us, and so he gave us therapists to help us through that stuff. He gave us medication to not use as a crutch, but just to help us through as we're working through things. Like, for me, like, I got off Zoloft recently because I was like, I feel like I'm using it as an excuse to just not work through my depression. But, man, like, I wasn't suicidal this winter, and that was a big step up for me to not want to kill myself. Like, it was it was what, last year I had to go on suicide watch because I was like this close. Like I got everything taken out of my house, like nothing that I could have possibly killed myself with. My sister sat with me in my bedroom for a day just to make sure like I didn't kill myself. My therapist was on watch with me and saw me every day. So yeah, medications are helpful and they help you work through things, and therapists help you get to the end of the line to where it's like, I don't need that medication because I've gotten the help that I need.
Yeah.
And so for someone to not think through just how God did give us that to help us is just, I don't even understand that level of ignorance, honestly.
Yeah.
I think some of that is his generation. That's a generation who it's just like, yeah, we dealt with stuff and, you know, you just suck it up. You don't work through it. You just shove down your emotions and say we trust in God and call it a day, you know. And you do trust in God, but you also sometimes have to trust in God and say, okay, I'm going to take this medication for a little bit to let it help me.
Right. Well, I think, so 2 thoughts with that. The best way I've heard medication described, and I think this is, I want to make a disclaimer, like I'm not talking about, I think there are some diagnoses that do warrant medication, most likely throughout your lifespan.
Yeah.
There are just some that are more
especially with like
severe.
Bipolar and
yeah.
But
the best way I've heard psychiatric,
to keep you from harming yourself, harming others.
Yeah, to keep you just level.
Yeah.
But I think the best way, I also was on an antidepressant for 2 years. I also struggled with passive suicidal ideation back in 2020. And the best way that I heard medication described that really helped me be okay, because I was very resistant to going on medication, but I also was like, I want to die all the time, and I don't know why. And the best way I heard it described is psychiatric medication is almost like a cast. And what does a cast do? It creates an environment in which you can heal. And I think that was really helpful for me to hear when I was considering going on medication, was like, oh, this is helping me get to a more stable place so that I can address the root causes. So that I can take a look at what's actually going on. Because let's be honest, mental health concerns can have us in survival mode. I get the way with my anxiety. My anxiety has me to a place where I'm so heightened and like I cannot think rationally.
Right. Yeah.
And I'm a pretty logical person, but like it's a struggle. And so I think that's one helpful view on medication. Has just been helpful for me. And it allowed me to get to a more steady place, and I was able to safely get off of it last year, and thankfully the passive suicidal ideation has not returned, and like I'm very grateful for that. And I think a lot of that was because it allowed me to make significant changes in my life. Like being on it got me to this place where I could actually address some of the root concerns that were contributing to the depression, that were contributing to the anxiety. So that's just been something that's been really helpful for me.
Yeah. I think that's a good look at it too, because I know I have friends who have gotten on medication and that's just the crutch for the rest of their life, and then they don't work through their stuff, and it's like they feel better, but at the same time, like looking like outwardly in, it's like you're not thriving though. Yeah. Like I see where it's not actually helping you in the way that it's muting you out. There. Like your brain is almost just like asleep and you're just kind of living on autopilot. That's what it was for me on Zoloft. It was like, wow, I can breathe and think. But then I got off of it and I was like, whoa, I wasn't I had no emotion and wasn't thinking at all. Like it really was just like autopilot mode. Right. And sometimes
Zoloft again? We can edit this out. I was just curious.
Zoloft, I was on it for 2 years.
Okay, wow.
Yeah. I had a higher dose for the winter because of how bad the depression was for me. But yeah, and it was just like, it helped me in a time where I really needed it, because I was working through PTSD from my coma, and I just had a baby, and so it was like...
So you have a daughter, like,
Yeah, it was like, I need to be able to focus on her and actually think, and so it was helpful, but then it was like, I started doing therapy and getting off Zoloft, and it was like, wow, I've been living just on autopilot. Like, I wasn't living my own life, and so, yeah, I think antidepressants are a very good cast. Like, it helped me through so much. And I am on the other end where I'm like, wow, I am finding healing and I'm finding myself again. And that's a wonderful thing. But, like, being on it forever, oh my gosh, I can't even imagine that.
Yeah.
Oh, it's so much. And, like, I'm trying to shift into a vulnerable spot because, like, I know my parents listen to this, and I'm an oldest child. Like, it's very hard to, like, to know that you're, like, sharing things and you're like, oh, they're gonna ask me about this. So, like, where I am, like, right now, like, my mental health is really struggling right now.
You can cry.
I know, save space. I think I just, like, keep waiting for, like, the peaceful, like, pond to return. I feel like I'm in a kayak and I'm paddling and I'm being, like, hit in a million different spaces, and a lot of it is life circumstance is why I feel like I'm being kind of battered on the rocks a little bit. And I keep paddling with, like, this kayak, like, waiting to get to the peaceful pond. And I was driving here and I just felt like the Lord was like, you may just be in a kayak for a little while. And, like, that's just, I think you need to stop trying to search for, like, the pond where everything is, like, static and, like, calm. I think he's like, if you just kind of let me guide you in the kayak with beating against the rocks, I think you're gonna feel okay. And I feel like but, like, part of that is, like, accepting, I think, to me, because I've never done medication or anything like that, and not that I'm necessarily, like, I'm getting on medication right now for anxiety, but, like, accepting that, like, okay, that may be part of the being in the kayak is, like, maybe I should look into this to help me lean and focus on the Lord as I'm continuing to, like, just be in my kayak and, like, ride with the rapids and stuff. But yeah, like, this is an interesting conversation for me to be a part of, and I've been quiet because I've been processing and thinking through what I believe and stuff. I think because my mental health just is really, like, struggling right now. It's like high highs and low lows and very up and down, and I'm trying to navigate, like, all these different opinions and all these different sources of information and wisdom in regards to mental health. And I feel like conversations like this are really important, like, the openness of the conversation. Like, no one's getting defensive. No one's taking a hard stance left or right. We're trying to navigate. And I think it's because our intention is not to defend a certain cause or defend a certain opinion. Our intention is to create a space for people to receive healing and for people to feel seen and for people to feel, safe. You know what I mean? And so, yeah, that's interesting reading that quote from John MacArthur and just kind of diving into our own, like, our own stories with, like, mental health and that sort of thing. Yeah. It's wild. And I think everybody should be careful before because I'm very hot-headed. I can be very intense about some things. And while I do think some things are black and white, I think everybody needs to take a step back and remember that when we're talking about things like therapy or people with PTSD, depression, medication, all of those things, everyone needs to stop and think that you are responding to people with stories and people with hurt and people with experiences that are not your own. And so you might look at someone and say, how could they be that way? Yeah. You have absolutely no idea, like, what their life is and what they've gone through. Yeah. And I am totally feeling convicted in, like, my, like, I'm going to have opinions on this, where it's like, I don't really need to, because no one needs to have a bunch of opinions, like, on this stuff. Everybody, if we can all just focus on Christ and love each other where we are, I think that's where we're going to do the best work, honestly.
Yeah, I think you brought up a really great point about seasons, right? Like, the reality is some seasons are just harder than others, and it's not necessarily that we need to fix it.
Yeah.
We don't necessarily need to fix it. And this is the hardest conversation that I have with my clients, and I would say I am typically met with a little bit more resistance when we get to that point in therapy. They're like, well, what do you mean? What do I need to do? And I'm like, you need to sit with it. I'm at the point where, a lot of the work that I'm doing with clients is literally just helping them sit with their emotions.
Damn, it's hard.
It's so healthy, though.
Yeah. It is. And what's interesting is I'll use that very phrase, like, I want your homework for the week is to sit with your emotions. And my clients and I laugh about it because almost every single one gives me a blank stare. And they're like,
yeah.
What do you mean?
Yeah.
And I'm like, sit with your emotions. Like, in silence, not distracting yourself,
Yep.
not intellectualizing it either, which is so hard for people.
Really hard.
I literally want you to just feel the emotion. How is it affecting your body? Right? Because that's another piece that I think is really important to highlight in this conversation is so many of us are so disconnected from our bodies.
Yeah. How I'm trying to think of how to word it. If we were better at just listening to our emotions and sitting with ourselves in hard times, do you think therapy would be just as necessary as it is today?
This is one of those questions that makes me nervous to answer. I don't know that it would be as necessary. You know, I think God designed our minds and our bodies so incredibly. Like, it's truly just astounding to me. So I very much so work from the perspective that our mental, physical, and spiritual health are all intertwined. You cannot separate them.
Yeah.
You cannot. Even for my clients that are not believers, you still have some type of spiritual component to your existence, right? And so I think that our bodies, I mean, it's really important to understand our emotions are physiological as much as they are psychological. For every emotion that we experience, we have a physical response. But because so many people are disconnected from their bodies, people are like, that's a foreign concept to them. Which I think is why I get so many blank stares. Like, people are like, what do you mean?
Yeah.
Like, for example, when I get anxious, I get an adrenaline rush in a very specific part. It's the upper half of my arm. And it literally feels like adrenaline just coursing just through that part of my body. Why is that important to understand? That emotion needs to be released on a physical level.
Yeah.
It has to. But we don't. We try to intellectualize it instead. And with anxiety, you can't intellectualize your way out of anxiety. Anxiety.
Yes, I can. I'm hard enough, Stephanie. I can.
I know.
I can do it.
Anxiety lives in a part of our brain that does not interpret language.
Interesting.
So literally, you cannot ration grace.
Shut up! You don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah. So literally, when we try to rationalize our way out of anxiety, it's gonna keep coming back. Anxiety has to be experienced on a physiological level because there's an energy that goes with it. And so, yeah, I think there's a lot of wisdom in sitting with our emotions and figuring out ways that work for us to release them. So, like, for me, when I get tension in my body with anxiety, like, I need to, like, this is going to sound bizarre, but, like, one of the things that I learned from another practitioner was, like, putting my hands up against the wall and, like, pushing as hard as I can because it helps release some of that tension. And, like, sometimes it looks like dancing. Like, there's so much healing, I think, in dancing.
That is so fascinating to me. I went to see short side story. I went to see this specific doctor who does this specific thing where, like, she reads your, like, scan,
body.
does this, read your body, read your scan, like, that sort of thing. And she was, like, mapping out, like, my mental patterns and stuff, and that's what she told me, because I definitely struggle with anxiety. I've never been diagnosed, but I would self-diagnose that I definitely have anxiety. It's been present my whole life. It's never gone away. So I would self-diagnose myself with anxiety, but she was reading my mental patterns and just asking, we've never had a conversation, and she was like, do you like to dance? Or, like, do you dance? And I was like, I'm not a dancer, but I do, like, just little ballet twirls all around. Like, I just dance around my house. Like, I do that sometimes. And she was like, you need to do that more. She said, that's your release. She said, I'm watching it release stuff in your body. You need to dance more. And I was like, that's so sweet.
Yeah.
That, like, the Lord created stuff. I almost wonder, like, did God create dance because he knew that anxiety was real and he needed that release?
That makes me think of, I think it's in the Psalms of just David. And even when he writes sad Psalms, he danced with the Lord. Wow. But it makes me think of, like, lately, when I have bad days with Ruth, she has a playlist of all her favorite songs. And I've learned to get her to stop crying. We just dance together. And I just get to hold her
And it's just a beautiful thing, and it's so crazy that, like...
The poor men listening to this episode.
Sorry, guys!
We're all just
No,
crying.
I love it. It's beautiful.
Men, you need to cry, too.
Yes. Ooh.
But, like, it's just so crazy how, like, the simplest things can help us through the hardest times. Like, I've learned with my therapy, like, I see a chronic health therapist now, and the stuff he has me do seems so stupid sometimes. And he tells me, he's like, it's gonna sound stupid, but I'm gonna ask you to do something for me. And I was like, okay. And I've realized, like, he's really just asking me to sit with my emotions most of the time.
This therapist has been great for you.
It's been amazing. Like, he's the reason I'm off
He's been
Zoloft.
awesome. Yeah.
Like, and he's and, you know,
Helping
I think...
you meditate on scripture.
Yes. And I've learned, like, the more that he's helped me sit through my emotions, my body's healing. Like, I'm not on, like, my steroids anymore, and my body's fine. And I realized it's, like, when I have a hard day, I'm just, like, sitting through my emotions. And so it's just so crazy that, like, when we hold that stuff in, how much it damages your body. Like, I told my therapist, like, my health got worse after Stephanie and I's grandparents got divorced. Like, it just took a hard turn. I left my hometown, I lost my friends, like, so much happened in that time, and then I got incredibly sick, and that's when I started getting hospitalized constantly. And, like, I've worked...
You haven't been back for a long time.
Yeah. And, like, I've talked through those things, but I didn't work through them. It was, like, most of my therapists, it was like, okay, we'll talk through it, but it wasn't doing anything for me. And this therapist is, like, having me focus on scripture, teaching me ways where I can sit with my emotions and be comfortable with it, or dancing with my daughter to make her and I both feel better. And, like, I'm noticing my body healing too. And so it's just so crazy. I think that's why the question about therapy came into mind, like, how much would we need therapy if we actually just sat with our emotions? Because, like, it's, you know, been explained to me, like, our trauma is stored in our body, especially women, especially, like, we hold it in a certain place in our body if we don't work through it, and that causes so many issues. And so, but it's also really hard to sit with your emotions, and sometimes you do need a therapist for that, because, like, when he was just like, well, do you sit with your emotions? And I was like, I don't know what you mean by that. Like, you mean actually just sit and feel my emotions? Like, how directly do you mean that? And he was like, okay. And so he gave me, like, specific stuff that I could do. But it's just crazy how healing that is alone.
Yeah. And I think a lot of people do need the assistance of a therapist when they're first starting this, because especially for those of us who have tendencies to hold our emotions in, when we start to feel them, they can be very overwhelming.
Yes.
And so I actually think there's a lot of wisdom in seeking out a therapist to help with that. So I actually, with a lot of my clients, everybody's different. Some clients feel very comfortable starting it off on their own, and others are like, oh, that sounds horrible. And I'm like, so what if we started doing it in session together?
Yeah.
So I'll sometimes with my clients be like, let's pause here. I'm observing a lot of emotion, and they want to keep talking, right? They're like, no, let's keep talking. I'm like,
that's totally me. Oh my gosh.
and I get it. Oh, same. I'm like, no, I want to talk my problems
out.
all the way.
Yep.
Probably like 5 times minimum.
Yeah.
So I relate to my clients when they're like, we're going to pause. And I'm like, yes. And I have my clients do what we call a body scan. So basically, and this is especially helpful, I think, for clients who are really disconnected from their bodies, of like, you start at the top of your head and you scan down and just notice any sensations. Anything. It could be like a little twinge in your shoulder. And it's amazing what I hear from my clients. Like, at first it's like really awkward for them, but then they're like, oh, my jaw is clenched right now. Oh, I feel tension in my shoulders.
Amazing how much you sense that once you start practicing that.
Yes.
I do even just, I do a hypnotist at night to help me fall asleep, but she does the body scan. And so even during the day, I'll be like, oh, I'm clenching my jaw and I have a migraine. Yeah. And then I'll stop clenching and I'll be fine.
Yep.
It's wild.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I think that sitting with our emotions, there's real wisdom in it. And I do think that if we can learn to do that things wouldn't build up quite as much, is how I will phrase it.
Yeah.
I'm not going to say that it would be the cure-all.
Right.
Because to be honest, I don't think there's any one method.
Right.
And I think, again, everybody's treatment is so different. What I do with one client might look vastly different from what I do with another client, even if they're coming to me for the same concern.
Right.
But yes, I do think there's a lot of wisdom with it. And I think that's, when working with my clients, that's my goal. My goal is not to reduce my client's stress in life. This life is hard. It's good. It's beautiful at times. But life is just hard for a lot of people.
Yeah.
We all go through seasons, right? And so I tell my clients, my job is not to reduce your distress. My job is to help you build a relationship with yourself so that you can trust yourself to deal with the stress when it comes up. That's my goal.
Yeah.
That's what I want for my clients, because I do think that there's a lot of fear for people of once they start therapy, stopping. I had one client several months ago. I was like, I really believe you're ready to go to every other week. I see it in you. I see the growth. I see all the changes that you've made. And she looked at me and she was like, every other week? And I was like, yeah. I was like, look, you're the client. I'll ultimately leave it up to you. But can we at least try it? And here we are 4 months later, and we're ready to go down to every 3 weeks. That's the thing too. Sometimes we have to go out and do this stuff on our own. Because at the end of the day, we have ourselves, right? Hopefully we have community. Hopefully we have people standing by us. But the reality is people aren't available to us 24/7.
Yeah.
So when it is just us at the end of the day, what skills have I worked on? Am I living in alignment with my values? Am I making this decision out of obligation? Or am I making this decision because it aligns with the values that I've identified for myself? Those are the questions I think that also would be really helpful for us to start asking on a consistent basis. Because we run on autopilot. The brain wants to simplify everything. So we have to be really intentional about creating a new autopilot. I think that's what I see a lot of adults doing right now. Their autopilot is no longer working, and they have to create a new one. And if I could emphasize anything, it would be this work takes a long time.
Yeah.
Very, very long time.
Yeah.
And I think that's part of, too, why we see people, in and out of therapy so frequently. There's no shame. Again, I've been to, 5 different therapists over the past 10 years.
Yeah.
But I think that's why we see people cycling, because the reality is there does have to be a dedication to this. And my life coach, Rocio, has been working on that with me so much. God bless her. She, so I'm transitioning into the role of life coach, which I'm so excited about. I've known for...
Can we pause super fast?
Yeah.
Quick?
Yeah.
All right.
Whenever you're ready.
Okay. Hold on. My thoughts just left me.
You're all good.
I was saying that dedication is really required, whether it's therapy, life coaching, like I mentioned earlier, the brain is wired for familiarity. So because of that, creating sustainable habits is really counterintuitive to humans. And not a lot of people know that. This is part of why New Year's resolutions fail so often, because we're trying to make too much change all at once. And the brain actually does become overwhelmed by that, because you have neural pathways that have been established for years. And your brain's like, I have this nice little path carved out for you. Why are you trying to create a new one?
Right.
So I think that's really important to understand, because so much of this work is making really small changes. And I see a lot of frustration for clients with that. And even Rocio, in working with me, has really had to challenge me in this. I've been working with her for 3 years, and I've known for the entire 3 years that I do not want to spend the remainder of my career being a therapist. And, hi!
Desmond has joined us. He's joined the ladies.
And, she really challenged me one time. She said, we had identified, I needed to do something positive for myself. So she was like, I want you to take walks. And I want to say it was, back in December. She just looked at me on one of our calls, and she said, so when are you going to start taking walks? And And I was like, it's a walk, Rocio. And she was like, yeah, but you can't trust yourself to follow through on that one thing. So how are you going to trust yourself to build a business? And I was like, ooh, okay.
Wow.
That was kind of rude.
That was
No,
good lunch.
she's so patient with me. But it was a really good challenge. And I think has been really helpful for me in my personal life, but also in my work with my clients of like, no, like we have to be faithful in the small things.
Yeah. Well, because if you can't be faithful in the small things, you can't be faithful in the big things.
Yeah.
Right.
Like, it's going to overwhelm you.
Well, and here's the thing, too. For every behavior that we engage in or that we don't engage in, we send messages to our brain.
Yeah.
So every time I tell myself, I want to spend 30 minutes a day moving my body, and then I don't do it, the message that is being sent to my brain, if that's a consistent thing, is you're not reliable. That's the message that I'm receiving. And so I think understanding that is really important, because I think a lot of the times I've seen people come to the therapeutic process like, I need my life changed and I need it changed now.
Yeah.
I think there would also be a shift in people's healing journeys if we stopped waiting until it got that bad.
Yeah.
And that goes back to not being disconnected from ourselves, right?
Yeah.
Like, I think reality is a lot of people hit rock bottom before making change, but we don't have to hit rock bottom.
Yeah.
We don't have to. Like, if we are really connected with our values, if we have an identity established, you know, and I think that relates to our spiritual health a lot as well.
Yeah.
Who God says we are. And if we're seeking after that, I think that there's so much power in that, and we want to be hitting rock bottom as often as we do in our society. And so I think that's where like discernment is also important. Like if I could have people walk away from this podcast with one thing, it's there is value in community, there is value in therapy, there's value in life coaching, there's value in medication. And it requires discernment to know which of those paths is the best for you right now.
Yeah.
And also keeping in mind that what's right for you in this moment might look different 3 years from now.
Yeah.
I very much so am thankful for my therapy journey. I also unfortunately had a lot of therapists who said some really harmful stuff.
Yeah.
Some stuff that, and look, my clients could probably say the same about me, so I know there are moments where I have misstepped. So I don't want to perpetuate the idea that therapists can never mess up. We're human as well, right? Like the reality is sometimes I just say things without thinking.
Yeah.
Therapy was really helpful. I'm so glad I did it. And at the same time, life coaching has been the most transformative process of my entire life. But I also have a life coach who is led by the Holy Spirit.
Yeah.
And,
sometimes that's what you need, though, because I was going to say, like, you've had a lot of growth in the last 10 years, but, like, it was, like, very obvious when she met Rocio. Like, it was just like, whoa, Steph's making changes and making moves.
Yeah.
And I think the last thing, like, speaking of, like, there's a use for therapy and life coaching or even medication or community. What do you think is, like, how do you know the difference between those, like, versus, like, if you need therapy or if you need life coaching, or if it's just like, oh, I don't have a good solid community to lift me up?
Yeah. So what I would say is, obviously therapy is mental health treatment. So when you notice that you're really consistently struggling with your mental health, you're struggling to control your moods, you feel like you don't know how to cope in healthy ways, I think that's when therapy can be really beneficial, right? Because that person is going to be able to help you access resources as well to help you work through whether or not you want to go on medication, or whether or not you think that just some habits need to be changed, so learning healthy coping mechanisms. You know, medication, I think, is such a personal decision. There's just so much that we don't know about psychiatric medications.
Yeah.
That was something that I really wrestled with. For me, my criteria was the passive suicidal ideation. Like, I was like, I cannot live like this every day.
Yeah.
And I was also working in a psychiatric hospital at the time during the pandemic. And I was like, yeah, this isn't going to work. So for me, I knew. I was like, look, I don't want to be on medication forever, but I know right now I need it because I am not I'm not even I'm barely functioning at that point.
Yeah.
But then, like I said, last year I felt I've made some really significant changes in my life, and I'm going to try getting off of it. If you do that, please consult with your doctor. I'm going to make that disclaimer.
Because I have made that mistake.
Yes. Please do that with a doctor, because there could be withdrawal symptoms of your psychiatric medication. So,
well, and also I just found this out because I'm stupid and got off my medication by myself, but your brain physically changes if you get off an SSRI.
Yes.
So you get the wildest symptoms. I have not slept in a week.
Yes.
That is, I'm not a huge, talk to your doctor about everything, but, if you're getting off a psychiatric medication, you need to talk to them.
And thankfully, Grace and I, we have the same doctor, and she's so lovely.
She's amazing. She also goes to our church.
She does. Yeah, she's lovely because one thing I adore about her, and I think this is another thing, please take the time to find somebody who is a good fit for you.
Mm-hmm.
Oh my gosh, I cannot emphasize that enough.
Yes.
I see this more so with therapy, but people are like, oh, you're licensed, so you can
You
help
must
me.
be good. Yeah.
Y'all, I'm not the most gifted therapist. There's a lot I have left to learn. There are some really not so great therapists out there, and I don't say that to scare people, but to emphasize, please use your discernment.
Listen to the red flags too. There were multiple not multiple. There was a therapist I stuck with for a little bit, even though I wasn't feeling good about them, and then just felt really traumatized by them in the end. And I could have escaped that if I just listened to my gut.
Yeah, so finding a therapist that really feels like a good fit, I know that can be so frustrating, especially when you have to meet with 2 or 3 therapists.
Yeah.
But I cannot emphasize enough how important that is. If you are a Christian and you really need somebody to understand that, please seek out a Christian therapist.
Yeah. There are plenty of them.
There are a lot, because I historically did not do that, and it was there was a huge part of my life, they were a great therapist, but there was a huge part of my life that they didn't understand.
Right.
It's hard, when you're a Christian, because it's well, let's leave that part out. It's I can't. That's who I am.
That's my life.
That's literally a part of my identity. Yeah, and I would say the same goes for your doctor or a psychiatrist. I really appreciate about Dr. Calvin that, anytime we go to talk about medication, she first asks, how's my walk with God going? Every time. She'll look at me and she goes, so how are you and God? And I'm like, well, do we have time for that today? But she also asked about my physical health. What does exercise look like? What does diet look like? That's something that I value.
Yeah.
So I would just really encourage that for anybody who is seeking out a therapist or a psychiatrist or a primary care doctor. As far as life coaching and what the difference is between that and therapy, what I would say is life coaching, I think, is most beneficial to individuals who do feel like they're more in a steady place in their life. So this is for the person, so I particularly love working with women who feel really stuck, right? They have a lot of the knowledge, they've probably been to therapy quite a bit, they know a lot of their patterns, but no matter what, they just really struggle to get out of those behaviors. So individuals that are really highly motivated, that know they have a vision for their life, but just can't execute it, and need somebody to help them with reaching very specific goals. So my life coaching journey, it was God ordained. I just so happened to be at a retreat with my life coach. She wasn't normally a part of that retreat either. It was just really it was a God thing. And she offered to all of the attendants where she would give one coaching call for free. And I took her up on it, which I never do.
Oh, that's right.
I never do that. Because I'm always oh, this is awkward, and then you're going to feel obligated to keep working with them. But that one coaching call was enough for me. And so Rocio and I actually started out focusing a lot on my career and shifting that, but it's actually just turned into also creating a life that's really in alignment with my values and really helping me walk away from an identity that is no longer mine to claim. And so I would say that that's what life coaching is that's what separates it. It's not the treatment of your mental health concerns. Is that involved? Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Rocio and I talk about my anxiety on a regular basis. The difference is we're addressing my anxiety from the perspective of my life story.
Yeah.
So
how to get over that obstacle to get to where you want to be.
Yes. Which some people could argue, well, isn't that mental health treatment? There's a little bit of an overlap. I'm not going to lie. In my coaching, there has been an overlap. But the difference is that instead of like, how do I cope with anxiety in a healthier way, it's been, why are you still grabbing onto anxiety as though it's yours? What's in your story that this is something that you keep going back to?
Yeah.
What limiting beliefs do you have? What identity are you holding on to? So for me, that's looked like letting go of a victim mentality that has followed me throughout my lifespan. And her really working on the narratives that are holding me back. So I think life coaching is really a great option when, like I said, you feel you are in a more steady place with mental health concerns. You know that you want something more for your life, but don't know how to get there.
Yeah.
What are next steps? And if you don't know which one is right for you, like, you can talk to a therapist that you're looking at, or you can talk to the life coach. Like, that's something as well. It's like, I'm like, ask me, and I know the questions to ask to determine if therapy is the best fit or if life coaching is the best fit.
Yeah.
But yes, use discernment. Like, I will just say that over and over and over and over. Use discernment about who you work with. Just because the first person you reach out to, like, answers doesn't necessarily mean they're the person that you're supposed to be working with.
Yeah.
And I think that's so important. We all have different needs when it comes to the providers that we work with.
Yeah.
And you have to be in touch with what you need.
Right. Yeah. Well,
that's really good.
This has been a great conversation.
It really has been.
Yeah.
Sorry it's been chaotic all over the place because I have my child. Could not find childcare.
No, it's all good.
But we got Nanny Steven.
Nanny Steven, I was going to say. Yeah, wow, look at that belly.
Well,
He's
Steph,
hanging out.
Thanks for coming on and
thanks for having us.
talking with
one of
us.
my favorite conversations.
Mine too.
This
is great.
I've really enjoyed
it's been
it.
Excellent. Well, I'll definitely have to have you back on.
Yeah. So you are switching into the role of life coach.
Woo! Yes.
Are you still taking clients in therapy, or are you just trying to merge just fully into life coach?
I'm kind of open to where God takes it. So I do have a full therapy caseload right now, but I do have spots open for life coaching, which I'm really excited about. When you're a licensed therapist, you can only practice in the state that you're licensed in. So as a therapist, I'm limited to people who are in Kentucky.
Yeah.
Which is part of the mental health field that I really struggle with, because you're supposed to have the right to choose your provider. But if you happen to find a provider who can offer telehealth services, but they're in another state, you can't see them. So I, as a life coach, can see anybody, anywhere. I'm super excited to see where God takes it. But yes, I do have availability for 2 to 3 life coaching spots right now. So I'm in the process, it's not on my website yet, but I'm creating 2 programs right now. So one is called the Clarity Program, and that program is 8 weeks and is really designed to help clients identify their values, identify negative core beliefs, and how those beliefs are holding them back from making sustainable change. And then the alignment program focuses on all of that, but takes it a step further. It's a 16-week program. Takes it further into starting to make actionable change. So both of those programs have the opportunity to work with me beyond the set time, but that's just to start out with. So I'll have that information on my website eventually.
Yeah,
Grace,
we'll get there soon.
Great.
Sorry, I designed her website, so.
Yes, thank you to Grace. I would not have a pretty website without her. I tried to create one on my own.
It didn't look bad at all.
It was a little amateur looking.
Well, yeah, but you also chose a really bad website to design the website.
I didn't know. I just went with what was recommended to me.
Okay, that's fair.
Grace has done a beautiful job, so that information will be on my website soon. But yes, I do have those 2 programs, and also I'm just willing to talk to anybody to see, like, if they're like, I don't know if life coaching is a good fit. Like, again, like, I think that's one thing I'm so excited about, is that I do have the background in mental health, because it has offered so much clarity to me in this process of like how to help people differentiate between the 2. So yeah, I'm really excited to transition into this role. I think it's going to be good. I think the best way I could describe it is, like, I'm so honored to be able to work with my clients as a therapist to reclaim their mental health. And life coaching is just giving me the opportunity to dive into soul work instead.
That's awesome.
That's
really
exciting.
cool.
Where can our followers find you?
So my website is strengthinaction.com. My Instagram is strength.in.action.
Yep, and we'll link it in our podcast commentary. So
yeah.
But yeah, thanks for coming on.
Yeah,
Thanks
this has
for
been a
having me.
great
It's been
conversation.
awesome. Yep.
It's been fun talking to you.
Yeah. And we'll catch you next
As
time.
I say, we'll catch you next time.
Yeah.
Follow us, like, subscribe, all the things. Share this episode with your friends. Be sure to send us in any podcast ideas or topics you want us to discuss.
Yeah, and then PSA, we're no longer doing YouTube.
Our lives are a little too hectic
Yes.
to incorporate video into our podcast, and so we're just going to
Yes.
stick with this for now.
Yeah.
I think that'll be a good decision.
Yep. But yeah, you can listen to us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else you listen to your podcasts.
Great.
We'll see you next time, guys.
See you next time.